1916, and the French countryside was awash with mud, blood, craters, barbed wire, and thousands of miles of trenches cut into the earth which housed two vast opposing armies, each bent on the other's destruction. Located between the two opposing front lines was an area where only death existed, and was referred to quite aptly as no man's land. On this particular day, death was indeed looking for a victim as a hunter stalked their intended prey. But instead of a sniper peering down the scope of their rifle, or a machine gunner spraying hot lead over the barren expanse to try and cut down an enemy advance, the hunter in question was a small Jack Russell Terrier using its highly sensitive nose to track his quarry, a small rat. The small dog was no doubt blissfully unaware of the war-torn world around them and the grand events in which he was unwittingly a part of. All they knew was that their highly tuned sense of smell had located something, and the dog's natural instincts had taken over, knowing almost nothing of bullets and shells, and compelled the creature to pursue whatever it was they could smell. Escaping from the British trench, where he had lived for so long with his human friends, the dog made its way across no man's land, guided by its nose and the scent of rat, until it had reached another trench filled with yet more people. Excitedly, the dog found another human huddled down in the trench on the opposite side of the traversed space, and having no concept of nation, greeted him like a friend, unaware that he was now gathered with his previous master's enemy. The human stroked him and showed him affection in return. The dog would remember this human and imprint his loyalty upon him, loyalty that was returned as the human showed great care for the animal. The dog would remember this human, who he would stay with for over a year. But history would remember that man forever after as a personification of true evil. The man in question was none other than Adolf Hitler. Given the horror that this man unleashed on the world, it seems unfathomable that he could show any kind of warmth and affection to any living thing. And yet, quite on the contrary, Hitler was indeed an avid lover of dogs. But this love only serves to remind us of his evil, for he could treat animals infinitely better than he treated many people. In this episode, we are going to examine the Fuhrer's love for dogs, examine the role they played in the Fuhrer's day-to-day life, and how they were even an influence in his ideas for a racially pure world. Welcome to Wars of the World. The Jack Russell Terrier, which leapt into the hands of the future Fuhrer that day in the trenches, had a profound impact on Hitler. Those who served with Hitler on the Western Front never described him as an unpopular figure, but it was clear that he struggled to make personal relationships with his comrades. While he had no problem conversing with other soldiers on a variety of topics, he found it alienating when discussing topics of a sexual nature. Unfortunately for Hitler, this was a common topic of conversation amongst these young men, who were deprived of female companionship after spending such long periods of time in the war zone. When such conversations inevitably sprung up, Hitler would often retreat to a quiet corner of the trench and take to reading or indulging in his passion for sketching and painting. Therefore, the arrival of this little dog gave him something which he couldn't find in other humans at the time. The dog offered him companionship, comfort, and loyalty without condition. He decided he needed to name the dog, and so called him Fuchsl, which translates into English as Little Fox. Fuchsl was not only loyal to Hitler, but proved intelligent too, and during their time together, Hitler was able to train the little dog to perform a number of tricks. Hitler developed a deep fascination with his furry four-legged friend, remembering later in his life, quote, "How many times at Fromelles, during the First World War, I studied my dog Fuchsl. I used to watch him as if he had been a man. It was crazy how fond I was of the beast." End quote. Wherever Hitler went, the little turncoat would go with him, he now firmly serving with Hitler in the Kaiser's army. Then, in August 1917, Hitler and Fuchsl found themselves on the road to Alsace for a period of rest from the front line. During the journey, a railway official noted the small dog and became just as enamored with him as Hitler was. He therefore approached Hitler with an offer to buy Fuchsl from him for 200 marks. But Hitler would not be swayed and responded with, quote, "You could give me 200,000 and you wouldn't get him." End quote. A short while later, Hitler was getting ready to leave a nearby train station and began searching for his faithful companion. But for the first time in over a year, his loyal Fuchsl was nowhere to be found. Hitler began a frantic search for the little dog, but in the end, it would prove fruitless, and with a broken heart, he was forced to leave without his companion. Hitler had a good idea why, and accused the official who had tried to buy Fuchsl of stealing him, saying to his friend, quote, "The swine who stole my dog doesn't know what he did to me." End quote. There would be no happy reunion for Hitler and Fuchsl, but the little dog left an indelible impact on the man. Symbolism was extremely important to the Nazi mindset, as they sought to establish themselves as the new order in the post-war chaos. The swastika would obviously soon come to encompass every aspect of Nazi society. However, this was only the outermost layer of Nazi symbolism, for the Nazis often turned to nature to find examples and answers to the questions only their twisted minds would ponder. For example, some Nazis believed that humans, just like animals, actually had a mating season in the spring, which was the best time for a woman to conceive a child. This notion might sound insane to modern audiences, but it serves to demonstrate just how twisted and misguided many Nazi thoughts and opinions were. Additionally, just like in Nazi society, where their ideology dictated that there were useful, worthwhile people, and anyone else was akin to a parasite to the rest, so too in nature were there useful and useless creatures, although the rules dictating how animals were categorized as such were often unclear. Jan Monhaupt, author of the book Animals in National Socialism, explains, quote, "Sometimes they served as models, sometimes as images of the enemy, sometimes they were just a means to an end." End quote. In this regard, some creatures were used purely in symbolizing uselessness, and how that translates into society. If Hitler had emerged from the trenches as a dog lover thanks to Fuchsl, then given the historic rivalry between cats and dogs, how did he view cat owners? Well, simply put, in Nazi propaganda, with its meanings either hidden or in plain sight, the Nazis were wolves, the ancestors of the domesticated dog, because of their courage and loyalty to the pack. Therefore, cats couldn't be anything other than Jewish animals. Nazi writer Will Vesper characterized domestic cats as treacherous, false, and antisocial, because they stalked beautiful songbirds, and their loyalties were often divided based on selfish needs, rather than the Nazi wolves who always worked to the betterment of the pack, in this case, the German state. Vesper therefore concluded that cats were the Jews among the animals, and Hitler agreed, ignoring the fact that Fuchsl himself was a little traitor to his original owners. While these conclusions are obviously delusional, some have pointed out the historical similarities between both cats and European Jews, in the way they've shared an almost identical experience of being blamed and persecuted for a number of calamities across the European continent over the ages. Jews, of course, were often used as scapegoats for social or economic upheaval, while cats were famously blamed for the Black Death, which wiped out millions of people. In the latter case, cats were killed en masse in an effort to stop the spread of the disease, with those responsible being ignorant of the fact that as the natural predator of rats, the actual carriers of the disease, they were only helping spread the disease by killing cats. Therefore, it can be said that Vesper's comparison holds some merit, just not in the way he intended, while at the same time, it held an ominous warning to the Nazis for how their own actions invited their ultimate destruction. Curiously, however, it can't be ignored that this anti-feline ideology seemed to have a size limit, for while small house cats were viewed distastefully, larger cats such as lions, tigers, panthers, etc. were all admired. However, this admiration also served a purpose. While dogs served as companionship to Nazi leaders, particularly the man at the top, possessing these big cats demonstrated strength and superiority of character, Nazi examination of history concluded that many of the great rulers adopted lions especially as their symbol, claiming to have absorbed the positive characteristics of these animals. Hitler's flamboyant deputy and head of the German Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, who also held the title of Reichsjägermeister, or Master of the German Hunting Society, kept 7 young lions between 1933 and 1940. Rather than for a love of the creatures, instead Göring saw them as little more than trophies to further project his personal prestige. Hitler, on the other hand, remained forever a lover of dogs. Returning from the war, a bitter Adolf Hitler found himself living in poverty in a broken and deeply divided Germany. While Austrian himself, he felt the pain of German defeat and the disgrace of the Treaty of Versailles as acutely as though he had been born in Berlin. And living on the streets, he saw that without a strong leader for guidance, now that the Kaiser had abdicated, ideas such as communism, which he detested, began to spread through German society, erupting into armed conflict on the streets between rival factions on both the left and the right of the political spectrum. It was as he clawed his way off the streets and began to gain influence in the new National Socialism German Workers' Party that the next dog would come into Hitler's life. While he still had love and fond memories of Fuchsl, a little terrier was no longer the breed that suited him and his new position in politics. Instead, in 1921, he adopted a dog he would name Prinz, a smart-looking German shepherd, something which in the symbol-crazy Nazi party better suited the nationalist image they were trying to portray. However, according to some researchers, like writer Boria Sachs, the selection of a German shepherd went deeper than mere external appearances and reflected the Nazi psyche of there being a racially pure German. The breed itself had been brought into existence around the beginning of the 20th century by Max von Stephanitz, who aimed to create the Germanischer Urhund, or primeval German dog. Sachs therefore suggested in his book Animals in the Third Reich, Pets, Scapegoats, and the Holocaust, that Prinz and his brethren were, quote, intended to embody the virtues of the German people, and its inception clearly anticipated the Nazi attempts to breed human beings back to a primeval Aryan stock, end quote. Regardless of whether the adoption of this breed by Hitler was a conscious reflection of his plans to purify German blood, or he simply found the breed agreeable to his personal tastes and political ambitions, Prinz would be the first of several of the breed that would pass through Hitler's world over the following quarter of a century. As Hitler grew in popularity, so too did German Shepherds as the dog of choice for German families, especially those who were keen to show their support for the Fuhrer after he came to power in 1933 and ushered in a new, darker order. Having such a dog as a pet helped solidify the image of the ideal German family setting, at least in the eyes of the Nazis, as they portrayed it in their propaganda films. Being such a keen animal lover, upon entering power, Hitler initiated a number of laws safeguarding animal welfare, enforcing strict punishments for those who mistreated their animals. In an incredible twist of irony, these laws came into power at the same time as the Nuremberg race laws, which restricted the rights of Jews and other undesirables in German society. In fact, as the relocation and then deportation of Jews began in Germany, there was more concern amongst the Nazis and their followers as to what would happen to the pets of the Jews, which they would be leaving behind, than the welfare of the human beings they were making refugees. Having owned a handful of dogs through the 1920s and 30s, it would be in 1941, as the Second World War was in full swing, that Hitler would be united with the dog which would become most associated with the Fuhrer. Martin Bormann was Hitler's personal secretary, and as such held a place in his inner circle where he was often in competition with the other leading Nazis for the Fuhrer's attention. This led Bormann to gifting a small female German Shepherd puppy to Hitler, who was immediately enamored with the small dog, which he gave the name Blondi. Blondi immediately became part of Hitler's life, and it was rare for him to be any significant distance away from her, she even being allowed to sleep on his bed with him. Many who saw this master and pet together often remarked that there was no room for anyone else in Hitler's heart now that Blondi occupied it in its entirety, not even for Eva Braun. Braun was of course Hitler's longtime partner and the closest human companion Hitler had to a soulmate. Like Hitler, she too was fond of dogs, and kept two for company when Hitler was busy with running the affairs of the state, such as orchestrating one of the greatest tragedies in recorded history. Unlike Hitler, she was fond of non-German breeds, and owned two Scottish terriers, which she named Negus and Katushka, the two animals regularly joining her on visits to see Hitler at the Eagle's Nest retreat near the picturesque town of Berchtesgaden. However, Eva was always weary of allowing her treasured dogs to mingle with Hitler's Blondi, who was a significantly larger dog, and posed a threat to the two smaller Scottish terriers. In fact, reports from those who worked closely with Hitler's senior staff often remarked that Braun actively disliked Hitler's beloved canine companion, either fearing the dog or simply being jealous of the attention it received from the man that she loved. But Blondi was more than just a dog for Hitler to bestow his affection on. Blondi, like her predecessors, served a purpose in the Nazi propaganda machine by being used to portray Hitler as an avid animal lover. By bombarding the German public with images of him tenderly caring for the dog, the German Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, was able to subliminally plant the message that by association, Hitler was a caring and attentive Fuhrer to the public as well as his dog. During his time with Blondi, Hitler also took to teaching her tricks to impress guests he was entertaining, showing off not only her athletic prowess, but also her intellect. She was, after all, part of the superior German breed of dog, whom, like their human equivalents in the Third Reich, needed to prove their superiority over others. According to Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, Blondi was an exceptionally well-trained canine, able to jump through hoops and even climb ladders upon Hitler's instructions, whereupon she would subserviently beg for a reward. She was even said to be able to perform a rudimentary Nazi salute, much to the delight of Hitler and his entourage. It was not uncommon for Hitler and Blondi to attract a crowd of spectators, where she would show off these skills, as well as carry out tests to demonstrate how these skills were actually improving under the Fuhrer's care and training. He would instruct Blondi to climb up on a narrow pole placed horizontally a few feet above the ground, and time how long she could balance, or alternatively, to measure how far she could jump. Whenever Blondi would break one of her records, Hitler was known to glow with glee, seeing it as much of a success for himself as it was for her. However, despite what the propaganda ministry would have the German people believe, Hitler was not always tender to his favorite animal. As a dog owner, he was in fact a strict disciplinarian, and if Blondi ever failed to live up to his standards, she would often receive a cruel and painful punishment, but only when Hitler felt such punishments were warranted. Generally though, he was kind in his treatment to Blondi. Blondi always seemed to have a calming effect on the Fuhrer, and she arrived in his life at the time he needed her most. The puppy given to him by Bormann stayed with him as he effectively lived in his eastern headquarters for much of the war. Again, rather tellingly of the Nazi psyche concerning nature, this bunker was dubbed the Wolf's Lair. Taking Blondi for a walk in the surrounding grounds allowed him to escape the stressful and often uncomfortable environment within the Wolf's Lair, serving to reset his mood when his anger began to flare up with the frustration of the events taking place on the battlefield against the Allies, who were by late 1943 in the process of reversing the Third Reich's fortunes. Given Hitler's often fiery temperament, there were few in his inner circle who would speak out of turn with him regularly. One notable exception was architect Gerdy Troost, who had a difficult relationship with the Fuhrer, and yet he had come to trust her opinion on art and architecture. Like the Fuhrer, Troost also had a fondness for German shepherds, owning a male named Harras, and as Blondi matured, this led to Hitler suggesting the pair should be bred. Sometime in early April 1945, Blondi gave birth to 5 pups, unaware of the peril both she and her offspring were in, simply by being tied to her master. Hitler had by then retreated to his Berlin bunker, where he was organizing the last defense of the Nazi capital, as the Soviet Red Army enveloped the city and began to strangle it and its people into submission. The war was lost, and death was everywhere, and yet Hitler survived on both denial and a cocktail of drugs from his personal physician, often living in flights of fantasy where the Third Reich would be able to claw back victory from the jaws of defeat, with its wonder weapons such as jet fighters and V-2 rockets. Looking at his beloved dog's pups, he envisioned their future, growing strong like Germany would from this temporary setback, at least as he saw it in his broken mind's eye. He became particularly fond of one of the pups, whom he named Wolf, while at least one of the other pups was earmarked for Eva Braun's sister. It would of course not come to be. When even Hitler's delusions could no longer conceal from him the truth of his situation, the Fuhrer began contemplating suicide, but was fearful that the cyanide capsules he had secured for him and Eva would not work. On April 29th, he therefore turned to his beloved pet and had her swallow one of the pills. The loyal dog and new mother died, confirming the pill's lethality to Hitler, who was rendered inconsolable at the loss of the animal. The next day, Blondi's pups were all shot dead by Hitler's dog handler, Feldwebel Fritz Tornov, but he was spared this additional pain, for by then both he and his then wife Eva Braun were themselves dead. Soviet troops recovered Blondi's corpse as well as one of her pups, most likely to be Wolf's, as both were found near where Hitler and Eva's remains were said to have been discovered. The story of Hitler and his love for dogs has often been seen as softening the image of one of the most loathed men in history. However, closer examination of this facet of the Fuhrer only adds to his personification of being truly evil. For while he would shed tears of sorrow and anger over the disappearance of Fuchsl, who in all likelihood was still very much alive when they parted in 1917, he showed no such remorse when presiding over a movement which would lead to the industrial-scale murder of his fellow human beings in the millions, whom he viewed as inferior beings, even to dogs.